Hi everyone, we're just waiting for everyone to join and then we'll get started in a couple of seconds once everyone's here. So make yourselves comfortable. Yeah, there's about 40 of us here at the moment. We're expecting quite a few more. So I'll just wait to start properly until there's a few more people here. For those who joined yesterday, you know a bit of what we're doing today. Make sure that you're familiar with the Q&A button and the chat button at the bottoms of your screens, or pop those up. Feel free to put a hi message in the chat. That worked really well yesterday. So pop a hi message in, say hello, and then hopefully we can see where everyone's from. Pop those in the chat. Hi everyone, great, a few coming through. Put the city or even the town that you're from. Oh, Bahrain, amazing. Hello from Qatar, incredible. I love seeing where everyone's from. Oh, Hertfordshire there. Oh, tier 4 in London. Sorry about that, Joe. I hope you're having a good Christmas anyway. Oh, someone from Cornwall in tier 1 in the UK. Well done, you guys. It's beautiful down there. You're very lucky. Northamptonshire there. Tier 2. Hello from Morocco. Amazing. Thanks for joining us. The Netherlands. Hi, Jane. I think you joined yesterday as well, didn't you? Okay. How are we doing? I think it's a couple of minutes past now. We've got a good number here. I think we'll crack on. So welcome everybody from wherever you are in the world or in the UK. I hope you're having a good holiday period. And welcome to our second session of the MyTutor GCSE Biology Christmas course. So this session follows on from yesterday's session, which talked about the endocrine system and insulin and glucagon as examples of how hormones in the endocrine system work, and linking that into homeostasis in the body, so keeping everything level. If you didn't tune in yesterday, don't worry, today's session does stand by itself as well. We are going to look at treating diabetes and negative feedback today. And this is a topic that comes up in most syllabuses. So we've taken most of this content from AQA, but it does occur across all of them. So don't worry if you're not studying AQA. My name's Charlotte. I was lucky enough to tutor biology through the summer, through the MyTutor online school, and I did a couple of the half-term lessons as well. So a lot of you might have seen me before. I studied conservation and biodiversity as a master's degree at the University of Exeter in Cornwall. So I know how lucky you all are, those of you who are down there. It's a beautiful place. And before that, I did an undergraduate degree in biological sciences with study abroad at the University of Exeter. And I now work for a charity helping farmers to do good things for the environment. So I've been really lucky. I've been able to keep my biology going through into my career. Today, if you have any questions about kind of university and things as well, do feel free to ask them too. Okay, so I think that's everything for today. This session is an hour long, so we'll finish at 4. So let's move over to the lesson space and start with today's topic. So as I mentioned yesterday, we talked about the endocrine system, which helps with control in the body in homeostasis. So this fits into the homeostasis part of the syllabus, and it's a kind of small part of it, the endocrine system. And people tend to find it a little bit more tricky than the nervous system, which is the other mode of control in the body. So I thought it would be a really good time for us to kind of recap on that. So you might have covered this at school recently. You might be doing this as revision. This might be new, and that's okay. This should be a good introduction. So we talked about different parts of the endocrine system. We talked about where the different glands are in the body that produce different hormones yesterday. And then we took a case study of insulin and glucagon that are both produced in the pancreas. And those hormones work together to keep the blood glucose levels normal. So they work to keep, as part of homeostasis, to keep those levels normal in the blood. And then we briefly at the end talked about different types of diabetes. And diabetes is a condition caused by your body either not responding or not producing insulin, and so not being able to control your blood glucose levels. So today we're going to recap all of that. So those of you that didn't tune in yesterday should have a good understanding. And then we're going to talk about treating diabetes and negative feedback loops in the body as well. I'm going to stop a couple of times for questions. So pop them in the Q&A when you think of them, and then we can definitely answer those at different stops. I'll try and get through all of them if I can. I'm also probably going to ask you guys for your opinions occasionally, or answers, or we're doing some practice questions as well at the end. Pop all of those in the chat, just so that the Q&A is just questions that I can answer. It makes it a bit easier for us to monitor. But anything else, put in the chat, like we did with the hi messages earlier. Okay. So here is an image that we saw yesterday in yesterday's session, and it's a really good summary of how insulin and glucagon are used to maintain those blood glucose levels in the body. And I really like the idea of blood glucose being kept at a level like this tank in the middle. So what you're trying to do is keep that tank at a constant level. And this tank has lots of different taps here. And we can see that insulin controls these 4 taps at the bottom. So insulin controls what glucose is removed to supply cellular respiration. And it causes the increased take-up of glucose by cells. So for those of you that didn't join yesterday, insulin is a hormone that's released by the pancreas. And it travels through the blood, and it acts as kind of like a key to the door of body cells. And it lets glucose from the blood into those body cells. And of course, glucose is really essential for respiration. So how the body gets its energy, how we can make that energy that's needed for us to move, to breathe, to exist, to digest things. All of that is contributed to by glucose. And so insulin is really important for getting that glucose from the blood into those body cells. Once insulin has let glucose into those body cells, that glucose can be turned into glycogen, just in this message here. And glycogen is basically a string of glucose molecules, and it allows you to kind of store them at the back of the cell, like putting them in the larder or the pantry or the cupboard under the stairs, depending on what you do in your house. So glycogen is the stored form of glucose. If we have lots and lots of glucose and we've stored as much as we can as glycogen, our body cells also sometimes turn glucose into fat for storage as well. And that's when you start to see some weight being put on in the body, when there's so much glucose that it can be converted into fat. On the other hand, when blood glucose gets too low in the body, we mentioned another hormone called glucagon. And that has kind of the opposite effect of insulin. So insulin is when your glucose levels get too high. So then we need to move that glucose out of the blood and into the body cells. But if the glucose levels get a bit low, then glucagon is used. It's released by the pancreas, and it acts as a bit of a messenger in the blood. And it says, hey, we need to start breaking down some of that stored glucose. So some of that glycogen, often stored in the liver, will be broken down. And so you've broken that glycogen down into individual glucose molecules, and you can send that out into the blood, and then it can get to the muscle cells or wherever needs it most. Glucagon also controls the breakdown of amino acids or fats. So we mentioned that glucose can be converted to fats, and very occasionally amino acids too. And then that can be broken down into individual glucose molecules as well. So that's a kind of very brief summary. But basically, insulin is used to take glucose out of the blood and into the body cells, and glucagon is used to break down that stored glucose in the body cells and take it back to the blood. And all in all, we try to keep the blood glucose levels constant. So this is part of homeostasis, and homeostasis is keeping things constant in our bodies. If your body has problems with insulin, you may get a condition called diabetes. And I don't know whether anyone on the call today has diabetes or has relatives that has diabetes. If you do, then you probably know more about some of the things that we talk about today. So definitely, pop a quick message in the chat or in the Q&A about experiences that you've had with treating these diseases, if you think it would be helpful. So to run through, we did talk about this briefly yesterday, but let's run through it again. So type 1 and type 2 diabetes are very different, and there's a nice diagram here at the bottom that summarizes those differences as well as those bullet points that I've put up. So type 1 diabetes is when the pancreas doesn't produce insulin. So there's no insulin in the blood, there's no key there to turn on that tap into the body cells, so glucose can't leave the blood. Therefore, after you've eaten something, and glucose is something that we get from digestion, from after we've eaten a meal, particularly from carbohydrates and from sugars. So blood glucose gets very high after eating if you don't have that insulin present to help move it into the body cells. And eventually, the blood glucose gets so high that the kidneys start to excrete it in urine. And alongside the glucose, the kidneys also need to excrete water. So lots of urine is produced, and the person then feels very thirsty and tired because they've lost lots of water, and they've also not got the glucose in their cells for respiration. So you feel very tired, you don't have the energy to do anything. Fat and protein are also broken down to use instead, so the person loses weight. So any of that glucose that wasn't stored as glycogen that happened to be in the fat stores or occasionally in protein stores is also broken down. So the person becomes very thin. And type 1 diabetes starts in young children and teenagers and may be influenced by genetics. By contrast, type 2 diabetes is slightly different. So type 2 diabetes is when the pancreas still makes insulin, but not very much of it. So it's less than the body needs. And so eventually the cells stop responding properly to the little insulin that's produced. So you've got so little there that eventually the cells goes, hey, I just don't get it. I don't understand what this is. I've hardly ever seen it before. I don't know what to do with it. And so again, you don't have that key. So there's no way of getting the glucose out of those cells. Out of the blood, and into the cells. Type 2 diabetes starts as people get older and is strongly linked to obesity and a lack of exercise and a very carbohydrate and sugar-rich diet. It also has a strong genetic link, and in that way it's quite similar to type 1 diabetes. And in countries such as the UK and the USA, type 2 diabetes is increasing as obesity becomes more common. And you can see this diagram here. They've illustrated quite nicely the difference between the two types. So in type 1, there's no insulin at all. You can see no insulin there in the blood. Whereas in type 2 diabetes, the insulin is there, the yellow bits, but the body doesn't recognize them. So it doesn't respond to it and doesn't use the insulin to get the glucose out of the blood. So I'm going to stop there for a second and have a quick look through the Q&A. And then we'll move on to treatment of diabetes afterwards. Okay, first question, is this from the homeostasis and response topic? Yes, it is. Correct. Can you do 2 completely different courses at uni in the UK, e.g. biology and music or engineering and music? that depends on the university that you go to. Some universities, I'm guessing you'll think like in the US you have majors and minors. So some universities in the UK do something similar for some courses, but it tends to be quite rare. Sometimes you can do, I think, what's called a dual degree. So it's worth having a look at university syllabuses for that. The nervous system is named after nerves, so why is it called the endocrine system? That's a really, really good question. It ought to be called the hormone system, didn't it? And the answer is rooted in Latin, I think. Endocrine means to do with hormones and glands, I think. That's probably not the greatest answer, so I'm sorry. I know it's an extra word that you all need to learn, but unfortunately, endocrine system is hormones. Is there any chance you could explain insulin resistance, please? It's quite complicated. It's not something that you need to know particularly for GCSE, for most syllabuses. So insulin resistance is, I'm assuming that you mean explain why the body doesn't recognize insulin anymore. And that is because, so basically insulin is a protein, so it has a certain shape. And so the body cells are used to recognizing that shape, and then they fit together like a lock and key, like enzyme substrate complexes. Except it's between something that's on the outside of the body cell and the insulin that's in the blood. And basically, those body cells no longer recognize that shape. So they've forgotten that particular shape that they're looking for. That's a very simple explanation of it. Someone there pointing out that you have diabetes. That's great. Really appreciate any kind of insights that you have, particularly on the treatment section next, but don't feel like you have to. There's no obligation at all. Which one are you born with? Usually type 1 diabetes. Can people be born with diabetes? My friend at school has diabetes. Apparently it's inherited, or does it develop afterwards? So the answer there is kind of both. So usually type 1 diabetes starts when you're very young. So rather than really being born with it, you're born with the genes that make you susceptible to diabetes, and then you develop it very young. And type 2 diabetes tends to develop when you're older, but again, you might be genetically predisposed to have that. Are we doing Kahoot? Kahoot tomorrow. Tune in tomorrow, people, for a Kahoot. As type 2, what qualifications do you need for dentistry? That's a really good question. Dentistry, I think you need science A-levels. I'm not sure to what grades, and I think it depends on the university. I would assume that you would need biology, chemistry, possibly maths. But again, best to check with the universities that you're looking at for dentistry, to have a look on UCAS and see who offers it and what they're asking for. Is coronary heart disease and diabetes linked? So they are linked by the fact that both can be something that you're more likely to get if the body is quite overweight. So with coronary heart disease, it just means that there's more strain on all organs, and you're more likely to have that higher cholesterol level, more likely to get those blockages that form coronary heart disease, and therefore possibly have a heart attack. But for diabetes, it's slightly different because it's to do with the insulin. So they're linked by the fact that both of them can be, the chances of having both of them can be increased by being overweight. Which type of diabetes has a greater chance of danger? Oh, interesting. Good question. They're both pretty dangerous. Type 2 diabetes can be cured more by lifestyle choices, so we'll talk about that in a second, whereas type 1 diabetes, you need more kind of medical intervention. What's the difference between homeostasis and hormone? Hormone is a chemical messenger in the blood. Homeostasis is what we use to describe the body trying to keep lots of levels kind of normal. So be that temperature, blood glucose levels, water content in the body. Do you need to know insulin resistance for AQA, GCSE? You don't need to know the specifics that I just talked about. You do need to know about diabetes. Which diabetes is more dangerous? We've kind of answered that one. Can type 2 turn into type 1? No, it's one or the other. Why can't insulin be produced as a pill? Why do we need to inject it? Hold on, we will answer that one. If type 1 diabetes means that blood glucose gets very high, why does this mean there'd be a lack of respiration? Because in type 1 diabetes, the blood glucose levels are high, but there's no insulin to act as that key to get it into the body cells where respiration takes place. So there'd be no respiration because that glucose doesn't get into the body cells. It's only in the blood. What do you need to be a neurosurgeon? You would need to study a medicine degree, and a medicine degree usually requires biology, chemistry, and maths at the level. Did I always want to do biology, and was it my favourite subject? Yes, and yes, I love it. I love looking at what happens in the natural world around me. I'm an ecologist, really, so I like looking at animals and habitats and how they all interact. I think we've answered the type 1 and type 2. Is there a relationship between type 1 and type 2 diabetes? No. Apart from the fact that they are both caused by problems with insulin. Why do people inject themselves? We are coming to that. So I think that's it. What are the effects of high blood glucose is the last one there as well. And high blood glucose, as we said, means that eventually your kidneys need to remove glucose. So all of that is here. So the kidneys excrete the glucose in urine, lots of urine is produced, and the person feels really thirsty and tired, loses weight, and becomes very thin. Okay. How do we treat type 1 diabetes? So, the first and most usual method for treating type 1 diabetes is to inject insulin before meals. Insulin, as we kind of briefly came across in those answers, is a protein. And normally our stomach digests proteins. So we need to inject insulin straight into the blood rather than taking it as a pill, as was mentioned in the Q&A there. So it's not broken down by mistake in the stomach before it can get to where it's needed. So we inject insulin straight in, and it causes the body cells to take up glucose. Glucagon then works as normal when needed to cause glycogen in the cells to be broken down. So we can inject insulin straight in, it then works as normal because the body cells in type 1 diabetes patients still recognize insulin, it's just that there's none being produced. So you inject that in and the system works as normal. Meal and exercise planning are really important for people with type 1 diabetes because you're trying to keep those blood glucose levels constant. You need regular meals, so regular small meals, and remember you're going to have to inject that insulin before each meal to make sure that your body is equipped to remove the blood glucose once it's gone through the digestive system. So you need to plan those regular meals and your injections, and you also need to plan exercise because, of course, when we do exercise, our body respires a lot. We need lots of energy to make our muscles move, and so we need lots of glucose so that we can do lots of respiration. So if you are someone with type 1 diabetes, then we need to keep those blood glucose levels steady and make sure that the insulin is there to allow those cells to, body cells to take up as much glucose as they need to fuel that respiration. Muscles need more glucose when exercising. So you need to plan your injections around meals and exercise as well. And here there's a little kit here, constant monitoring of blood sugar levels and carbohydrate intake. So that's monitoring the glucose that goes in your food and that's present in your blood. It's part of life with type 1 diabetes. So you can do these little blood tests here to show whether your blood sugar is too high or too low, and then you know whether you need to inject. Now, some of you might have noticed that these are treatments, not cures. So this certainly gets around the problem of the body not producing any glucose, any insulin, but it doesn't cure it. Can we cure it? So there's 3 methods that have been trialed for curing type 1 diabetes. The first involves transplanting a pancreas. So a couple of you I noticed have did say in the Q&A or the chat that why couldn't we, use someone else's pancreas? Yeah, they're trying it. It's difficult, it's very risky because it involves an operation. Tend to be very few donors available because you have to have a pancreas that will be accepted by the other person's body, so it has to be a match. And then once you've had that operation, because you've put something in the body that is from someone else's body, quite often the body will react to that and will say, hey, we don't want this here, this isn't ours. And so the patient must take immunosuppressants for that to control the immune system and make sure that the body doesn't reject that organ. So you're really often trading one thing for another. You're trading those insulin injections for immunosuppressant tablets. The second thing that's been trialed is transplanting the cells that make insulin. So rather than just the pancreas, the organ, transplanting the cells themselves that make insulin. And that's been tried with both living and dead human donors, but with limited success. And again, the body does tend to reject cells that aren't its own. So there have been quite a few problems there. So to get round that problem with rejection of cells, stem cells are a possibility. And stem cells, as most of you will know, if you've come across that part of the syllabus yet, are cells that can turn into any other type of cell. And there are different types of stem cell. Embryonic stem cells can turn into anything. Adult stem cells tend to be able to turn into fewer types of cell. And in 2005, embryonic stem cells were used to produce insulin-secreting cells and worked successfully in mice. So they used embryonic stem cells to do kind of method 2, so to put in cells that make insulin. And it did work in mice. In 2008, they managed to turn pancreatic cells of mice into insulin-producing cells, with the idea that perhaps we could do that in humans. So perhaps we could use some of our cells that do other things and turn them into insulin-producing cells. And they've tried a similar technique using adult stem cells from patients with diabetes. And the hope is that genetic engineering will be able to be used to fix faulty cells without risk of rejection or the ethical concerns of using embryonic stem cells. Because there's often lots of questions to be asked about using embryonic stem cells. Is that right? That embryo hasn't had a choice about whether to donate its cells. So lots to think about there, and lots of things. This is the sort of content that might come up in kind of a 4-mark question. So explain, methods that might be used to cure type 1 diabetes. Some of the ethics behind there. Okay. What about type 2 diabetes? So type 2 diabetes, if you remember, develops once you're older and is strongly linked to being overweight or obesity. And rather than having to inject insulin, this form of diabetes can often be controlled using the 3 steps at the top of this slide. So eating a balanced diet and controlling carbohydrates, losing weight and doing regular exercise. So having a bit of a sort of balanced, healthy lifestyle, balanced diet and regular exercise can often be used to control type 2 diabetes. If these don't work, and it's quite possible that people might have other conditions that mean that they can't do some of those things, that they can't eat some foods, that they can't do regular exercise, then there are drugs that can help insulin to work better. So if you remember, type 2 diabetes is where the body cells don't recognize the insulin. So the insulin's there, or not being produced very much, but the body cells just don't see it. So you can get drugs that help the insulin to work better and help the pancreas produce more as well. And you can reduce the amount of glucose that's taken up with food. And as a last resort, insulin injections can also be used for those with type 2 diabetes, but you would try the other steps first. Okay, I'm going to leave that one up and just have a quick flick through questions again before we go on to talk about negative feedback. Nadia's given her perspective in the chat as well. You have to inject yourself with insulin and it has to be measured by how many carbs you eat. Yes, exactly. So you have to know what you're going to eat and then you can inject as much insulin as you need. You don't have to do it with every meal, only the ones where you have carbs, especially in the evening. It's interesting. And there's no permanent cure. Okay, can a person with type 2 diabetes donate their pancreas? Oh, that's interesting. I suppose if it was compatible, you might, but it depends how much. So type 2 diabetes can also mean that the pancreas isn't producing very much insulin, so you probably wouldn't want to use that pancreas because there would be the risk that it then wouldn't produce enough insulin in the person that you donated it to. Do type 2 diabetes people have to check their blood sugar levels? It depends on the severity of the condition, I believe. Why do some diabetes patients have dogs to help them? So diabetes can have quite long-term effects, and it can affect other things. I've noticed another question was saying, why do people with diabetes have to get their feet checked? And the answer is that I'm not quite sure. I know that it can have an effect where it does affect your feet, and I think that's to do with circulation, but again, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert, I'm afraid. So some of those long-term effects, so for example, if it's affecting your feet, can mean that you can't walk very well and things like that, and so sometimes assistant dogs are needed. And the other thing is that if you have diabetes, it can leave you a bit more vulnerable to other conditions as well, just through, what you're having to do to control it. So sometimes it's those other conditions as well that need other sorts of treatment. Do people with type 1 diabetes have to eat someone sweet to keep the blood sugar level steady? I think that's supposed to be something sweet. So yes, sometimes it's sweet things, but other things have carbohydrates as well, so it depends. What does immunosuppressants mean? Immunosuppressants are drugs that are used to suppress your immune system. So you can kind of get it from the word immunosuppressant, suppresses the immune system. And so they're often used to make sure that the body doesn't reject something that isn't part of it, like a transplanted organ, basically. How successful are pancreas transplants? I don't know the figures exactly, unfortunately. I think there has been some success, but not reliably enough that it's become a mainstream cure. By doing all the right things, can you get rid of it? No, you can control it, but at the moment, there's no permanent cure. Does type 2 diabetes have anything to do with poor blood circulation? I think so. I'm not sure on the specifics of how, but I know that they are linked. Do I think that taking 4 A-levels, 2 of which are sciences, is too much? That depends very much on your school and your attitude to studying and your abilities and capabilities. So I'm sure that, your tutor would be much better place to answer that question. I know a lot of people do sometimes do 4 A levels now, and it can be useful for some universities. Thoughts on what A levels to do to be a pharmaceutical scientist? Well, that'd be a great career. Biology, chemistry, and maths are kind of the core ones. You might consider physics instead of maths. Biology and chemistry are definitely the core ones there, and it's worth kind of having a look again at university prospectuses, seeing what they need and which university courses offer the sort of modules that would be helpful to you for wanting to go into pharmaceutical sciences. So that'd be more kind of microbiology, human biology, some of the biochemistry things as well. My friend's mum had diabetes when she was pregnant and she doesn't anymore. Is this to do with weight gain during pregnancy? Oh, that's a really good question. Thanks, Urs, for asking that. And the honest answer is that I don't know. I have heard of that before, that when you're pregnant, you can be more susceptible to diabetes and that it can then be a bit temporary. But obviously when you're pregnant, your blood glucose is also being used for your baby as well. So I'm not sure on the specifics of that. It would be a really good thing to research. I'm not sure it's necessarily to do with the weight gain, because I'm not sure that you necessarily put on much more fat when you're pregnant. Probably a bit more. But obviously a lot of the weight gain is due to the baby. Is kidney failure caused by diabetes? No. Is the short answer to that one, but sometimes they can be linked because of the kidney trying to get rid of excess glucose. What careers can you go into with a biology A level? And this came up yesterday as well. So there's all sorts of careers that you can do with biology. It's a really transferable degree. So specifically, you can go into biological research in all sorts of different fields. So being a pharmaceutical scientist, so not necessarily attached to a university, you can work in big laboratories that are producing medicines or cures. You can act as a researcher as part of the university and research kind of whatever piece of biology interests you most. You probably need to do a postdoctoral degree, or a doctoral degree, a PhD, in order to do that. You can do that on any sort of biology that interests you. If you're more the human biology side, there's all sorts of careers in nutrition, working with athletes, anything like that. If you're more into ecology or zoology, that's kind of my field. There's all sorts of things you can do. So you can be an ecologist doing surveys for different companies to make sure that habitats are kept in suitable conditions, or to mitigate the effects of building on some areas, making sure that not building on rare species, or that you've made provision for them elsewhere. My work is to do with helping farmers to do good things for the environment as well. So that's often to do with species too, and climate change. It's also linked in there. So there's all sorts of things you can do. It's also a really transferable degree. You get lots of transferable skills. So a lot of the big companies, graduate hiring companies like accounting companies, some of the really big companies, particularly in cities, will look for biology degree holders. Law as well, you can transfer into law from a biology degree. So there's all sorts of things you could do. It's a very kind of flexible degree. And I know lots of my friends who I went through university with do all sorts of different things. So everyone does find a very diverse career. What A level should I take for being a vet? Biology, chemistry, maths, and I think some universities also accept physics instead of maths, but biology and chemistry definitely for being a vet. Have a look at the different universities that offer veterinary courses and see what they need from you. You usually need very high grades, A's and above. People with type 1 diabetes need insulin, but where do they get it? So you can obviously they get it through an injection, but the insulin in that injection is produced by pharmaceutical scientists. What career paths could I take with a health sciences degree? We've kind of mentioned that, so that'd probably be more into kind of nutrition, or public health is another avenue there. So doing research into how to make people's diets better, how to offer people better diets, and how to influence people to make good choices about their diets. Oh, here we go. Many people, someone's put in a little bit about peripheral arterial disease, which many people with diabetes have, which reduces blood flow to the feet if there is very much less circulation. And if it's very severe type 2 diabetes, people can lose their feet. That is very extreme. That's really interesting. Peripheral arterial disease. What A-level should I take to be a surgeon? That would be biology, chemistry, maths again, or possibly physics. Have a look at what universities that offer medicine courses need. Someone pointing out it's gestational diabetes during pregnancy. If people don't have enough sugar, will the doctor recommend them to eat lots of chocolate and sweets, or give them sweet medicine? I wish it worked that way. No. So occasionally having a little bit of chocolate can help when you've got a real kind of insulin or blood glucose low, but no, meal planning would be more around making sure that you've got a good balance. So those slow release carbohydrates as well as fast release. So chocolate and sweets are fast release sugars, but carbohydrates are present in things like bread, pasta, all of that sort of thing as well. So you need those slow release ones as well. Another good question, best tips for revising for biology. Do little bits at a time. Make sure you've got a copy of your syllabus, your exam board, what they want you to know. So make sure that you've got a copy of that and you can tick off each point that they want. Work out your best learning strategy. Do you learn best by hearing things, in which case record what you need to know and listen to it? Do you learn best by doing things, in which case write things out again and again? Do you learn best by looking at things, create diagrams, flow charts, word maps, all of that? Anything that you can do to help you kind of go over that information again and again and put it in different formats. Okay, lots and lots and lots of questions here. I think I'm going to have to come back to some of them, because otherwise we're not going to finish what we need to do this session. So let's do a little bit more. So negative feedback is the next thing that we want to cover. So we've talked a lot about how we want to keep blood glucose levels constant, and that this is part of homeostasis, which is the body trying to keep things constant. So a system that works to return to a steady state, that's homeostasis, keeping things at a steady state. Negative feedback is something that we use to describe when a response causes the opposite reaction to try and take that system back to normal. So insulin and glucagon is a really good example of this, because insulin is something that stops blood glucose levels becoming too high, and glucose is glucagon is an example of a hormone that stops blood glucose levels getting too low. So both of those act to try and keep that blood glucose level constant. And here we've got a bit of a graph to kind of try and demonstrate that. So you've got here, we've got a rise in something, and then if this was blood glucose levels, insulin would be produced and it would take it back to normal. And then if it got too low, then glucagon would be produced and it would take it back to normal. So negative feedback is a phrase that's used to describe a system that keeps trying to move things back to normal. So you've got this ideal level in this diagram here. And if the response, if the level rises or falls, then that change is detected and the response is to move it back towards the normal. So that's like the pancreas detecting blood glucose levels and then releasing insulin or glucagon as needed to take that blood glucose level back to normal. So apart from insulin and glucagon, another example of negative feedback is another hormone called thyroxine that we talked about briefly yesterday. And it's good to have kind of a couple of examples in your knowledge, I suppose, to pull out in response to questions in your exams. So thyroxine is a second example to have in your bank other than insulin and glucagon. So thyroxine is produced by the thyroid gland, which is in our necks, and it controls basal metabolic rate in the body, which is very important for growth and development. Levels of thyroxine in the blood are controlled by the pituitary gland and another hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. And this is a really clever system because the pituitary gland is kind of like the control center for the endocrine system. And as well as producing, as a gland, it produces hormones. And those hormones either act directly in the body or they can act as messengers for other glands. And TSH and the pituitary gland are a really good example of that. So thyroxine is the hormone that we need there to be a constant level of. And thyroxine is produced by the thyroid gland. But the pituitary gland is in charge of telling the thyroid gland how much thyroxine to secrete. So in order to do that, it uses a messenger hormone called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And basically, if thyroxine levels rise, then TSH levels fall. And that means that the thyroxine levels return to normal. But if thyroxine levels fall, then TSH levels rise. That stimulates the thyroid gland to release more thyroxine, and so levels return to normal. This graph is a good way of illustrating that. So basically, whether or not the pituitary gland releases thyroid stimulating hormone is what controls those constant levels of thyroxine, because that's what determines whether the thyroid gland releases thyroxine or not. Lots of kind of new words in this topic, and they all sound quite similar. So thyroxine, thyroid, thyroid stimulating hormone, and pituitary gland are those kind of four terms here that are really key, and you need to understand their relationship between each other. So pituitary gland releases thyroid stimulating hormone, thyroid gland releases thyroxine. And how much TSH is produced is what determines that level of thyroxine. And again, a negative feedback system, so you're always trying to have that thyroxine level as constant. So that's negative feedback. I also wanted to include an example of a hormone that isn't part of a negative feedback system, and adrenaline is a really good example of a hormone like that. So when we're stressed, angry, or excited, adrenaline is released. And most people tend to be much more familiar with adrenaline than thyroxine. So hopefully most of you have a good idea of what adrenaline does. It basically is what's in charge of our fight or flight response. And it's released from the adrenal gland, which is kind of on top of the kidney. And it increases heart and breathing rate. It increases the rate that glycogen is converted to glucose, so we can respire more if we need to run away really fast. Our pupils dilate to let more light in so we can see better. Our mental awareness increases. Blood is diverted away from the digestive system and to the muscles, and we are basically primed, ready to fight or to run away. And then once the danger is over, the adrenal glands stop releasing adrenaline and systems return to their resting levels. And this is not a negative feedback system. We're not aiming for a constant level of adrenaline in our blood. It's just there when we need it for that fight or flight response. And there's quite a subtle difference there, but it's a really important difference to notice. You're not working to try and maintain a constant level. It either happens or it doesn't. Questions? Okay, let's do 5 minutes of questions or a couple of minutes of questions, and then I've got one past paper question, so we can do a little bit of exam technique as well. Oh my word, you guys have loads of questions. It's really great. If I want to become a doctor, do I need to take A-levels or not? Yes, you probably do to get into a medical degree, but again, have a look at university prospectuses, check out what they need, whether there's alternative routes. Is a PhD the same as a master's degree? No, they are different. So you have your undergraduate degree, which is what you can do after A-levels. Then there's a master's degree, which is usually 1 or 2 years on top. Sometimes it's integrated into an undergraduate degree. And then a PhD is another degree again, but it's more like a job, a PhD. You do get paid a small amount to do it usually. That's usually 3 or 4 years to research a specific part of biology, a specific research topic. Some people with diabetes have to go on a dialysis machine. What's happening here? So dialysis is something that is used to treat problems with the kidney. So again, we don't have time today to go into the specifics of that, but if you have diabetes, it can lead to some problems with kidneys. And so dialysis can be needed. My job is to do with ecology, yes. So I work with farms to try and make space for wildlife on farms and to encourage good farming practice that helps with climate change as well and still produces really good quality food. Is carbohydrate the main factor of getting diabetes? No, diabetes is to do with your insulin production rather than the amount of carbohydrates that you're eating. How do you do medicine with maths, biology and physics? You would have to look in the university prospectus for that and see what their requirements are. Biomedical or mechanical engineering A-levels. Okay, so that would be slightly different. And again, I would make sure that you have a look into the particular courses that you want to do, the universities that you want to go to and what entry requirements they need. So use UCAS and other websites to check that out, because biomedical or mechanical engineers will need slightly different A-levels, more kind of maths, physics as well. For physiotherapy, again, so there's lots of you here asking for what A-levels you need for specific careers. Use the UCAS website, use university websites. They are there to make sure that you know what you need to get into them. Because some universities will need slightly different things for the same courses as well. So make sure that you use those. And lots of questions about different A-levels. I am going to stop answering those ones now because you definitely need to look on UCAS there and on university prospectuses for those in particular. I took maths, chemistry and biology for my A-levels. What is overactive thyroid? That's a really good question. So overactive thyroids produce a little bit too much thyroxine, from what I remember, and that influences your basal metabolic rate and other processes in your body, so growth and development in children in particular. So if you have an overactive thyroid, sometimes everything happens a bit quick. That's probably the best way of describing it. So people tend to speak a bit quick and they digest things a bit quick. And it can have other effects as well. It's quite complex, overactive thyroid. But it is linked to thyroxine. What is the basal metabolic rate and what's the difference between respiration and metabolism? That's a really good question. Basal metabolic rate is the rate of digestion and respiration and energy production at rest. And the difference between respiration and metabolism. So metabolism is to do with how much energy you're producing with respect to how much you're taking in. Respiration is purely that process of producing ATP, so producing energy from glucose. So glucose and oxygen gives out carbon dioxide and water and ATP. You tried searching for me on MyTutor but couldn't find you. Ooh. I will try and find you a link to my profile. I'll post that out tomorrow. Because exam boards are telling us some of the content a few months before the exams, would you recommend doing some revision on everything beforehand or revising just what they tell us after they tell us? I'd make sure that you do some revision on everything beforehand because a lot of the topics interlink. So you might find that although they've told you certain things, you might need an understanding of other stuff to have a more detailed understanding of that. So respiration's a classic for that, although I'm sure that will be on whatever exam board. So a good understanding of respiration helps with a good understanding of today's topic, for example. Yes, you can get adrenaline injections and they are used particularly for some so, for example, if you have got a nut allergy, often you'll have an adrenaline injection to help with that. Okay. Just scrolling through a few more. Okay, let's do this last question real quick. So this is the sort of question that you might have. Oh, that's come out very small. It's not very helpful. So I wanted to make the point here, just in this last couple of minutes, that questions to do with diabetes quite often have graphs. And we talked yesterday about reading questions and underlining the key points. So I wanted to talk about graphs here as well. So here, I'll read this out. The bar chart shows the number of people with diabetes in different age groups, which you probably worked out from looking at the graph. Before we even get to the question, with graphs, I always recommend making sure that you understand the axes, the units, and any patterns that that graph shows. So on our x-axis, we've got age in years, and we can see that's in several categories. So age 0 to 44, 45 to 64, 65 to 74, and 75 and over. So they're not kind of very constant age groups there. You've got 44 years in the first one, and then 19 in the second one, then 9 in that one, and then 75 and over. Our y-axis is the number of people with diabetes per 1,000. So this would be 60 people per 1,000 people. And we've got a key here, so we can see female and male. Looking at the chart, quick summary of it, you get more people with diabetes per 1,000 people as you go up the age groups until you get to 65 to 74, and then at 75 and over it drops. So that's a really quick summary. And you would use that then to answer the question, describe the number the number of males. Oh, that's not good if I can't read it, is it? I bet you can't read it. Here we are, I've got a question here. Describe how the number of males with diabetes changes between the ages of 0 to 44 and 75 years and over. And that is essentially what we've just done. And by describe, we know that that needs us to use data from the graph. So we would describe that rise and then fall, and we would say that it rises to a peak of males, and make sure you're reading the right one, about 130 people per 1,000, and then drops. So the 75 and over category. Okay, we better stop there because I'm conscious that it's 4 o'clock. I'm sorry I couldn't quite get to all of your questions, but definitely happy to answer some more tomorrow. We're going to talk about plant hormones tomorrow, and there will be a Kahoot. So definitely tune in again tomorrow at 3 o'clock for the last part of this course. Have a lovely evening, everyone, and thanks very much for coming.